Why did California just revoke 17,000 commercial driver's licenses? It feels like a huge admission of failure. One state officials really fought against admitting, even when it put people in danger on the roads.
That's absolutely the heart of it. And it's way more than just some administrative cleanup. What we're really looking at in this deep dive is what happens when these awful public safety crises, like fatal truck crashes, collide head-on with, well, intense federal enforcement.
Right.
California was essentially forced into a major political concession here, revoking 17,000 licenses issued to non-citizens who, according to the federal government, shouldn't have been behind the wheel of, like, big rigs or school buses at all.
Okay, let's set the scene with the immediate news hook because the number itself is pretty shocking.
Yes.
17,000 commercial driver's licenses, CDLs, revoked by California officials. And, for anyone who doesn't know, a CDL is what you need to drive the really heavy stuff. Semitrucks, tankers, buses.
Exactly. Heavy machinery. And these drivers, they were given just 60 days notice. That's it. And let's be clear, this wasn't California suddenly deciding to fix a problem on its own. Not proactive at all.
No.
No, this was pushed hard by the Trump administration, specifically Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. He'd been raising the alarm for months about licenses being issued improperly.
Oh, okay.
And the political heat just got turned way up after those really terrible, fatal truck crashes involving drivers who are in the country illegally.
Yeah, those were horrific. I remember the U-turn crash down in Florida killed 3 people. And then just last month, that fiery crash right here in California, another 3 people killed. Tragedies like that, they absolutely forced California's licensing standards into this, harsh national spotlight.
And forced the state, finally, to admit to what looks like a massive oversight, a really colossal one.
Okay, so let's dig into the specific reason California gave when they finally admitted this. They said it was about DMV documents, right?
That was the official line, yeah. State officials claim they reviewed the paperwork and found the license expiration dates went past the date the drivers were legally allowed to be in the U.S.
So they basically confessed they issued thousands of licenses that were flawed from the get-go based on federal immigration status.
Essentially, yes. But that admission, it didn't come easy. It took weeks of really intense back-and-forth negotiations and, frankly, federal threats.
Threats?
Oh, yeah. The federal response, led by Secretary Duffy, was very aggressive. He'd already put new restrictions in place and launched a nationwide CDL audit right after that Florida crash. It was clear this was a top-down enforcement push.
And Duffy had pointed fingers before, right? Not just at California.
He did. He initially claimed California and 5 other states were improperly issuing these licenses to non-citizens. But California was the first state his audit really zeroed in on, so they became the main target.
And this is where the federal government started using its financial power to make them comply.
That's exactly it. The money, the financial leverage, that's really key to understanding why California eventually, folded.
How so?
Duffy had already pulled back $40 million in federal funding from California.
$40 million?
For what? He said the state wasn't enforcing English language requirements for truckers. That was like a warning shot, a very expensive warning shot.
Okay, wait, let's pause on that threat. $40 million already gone and then threatening more. Is that level of financial pressure typical, or is this administration being particularly forceful here?
It's definitely aggressive. But legally, they can do it because the federal government holds the purse strings for most highway funding. And Duffy wasn't done. He then threatened to withhold another $160 million.
Wow, another 160.
Yep. Unless the state invalidated every single illegal license and addressed all the other concerns, we're talking a potential total loss of $200 million in highway funds.
$200 million. That's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. That means what? Road repairs don't happen? Bridge projects stall?
Exactly. It means delayed critical maintenance, halted projects, frozen infrastructure upgrades all across California. It's a threat that can paralyze a state's transportation plans.
So facing that kind of financial hit, plus the public outcry after the fatal accidents, California officials finally caved.
They did. And the federal side, they immediately claimed victory and framed it as an admission of guilt by California.
No time wasted there.
None at all. Duffy put out a statement saying California's action was an admission they'd acted improperly,
Yeah.
despite weeks of denying it. He put it in really stark political terms. I think the quote was something like,
Yeah.
after weeks of claiming they did nothing wrong, Gavin Newsom and California have been caught red-handed. Now that we've exposed their lies, 17,000 illegally issued trucking licenses are being revoked.
Oof. Caught red-handed. Strong words.
Very strong. The message from the feds was crystal clear. Our enforcement worked, and state negligence won't be tolerated.
But California didn't just roll over politically, did they? Even though they revoked the licenses, Governor Newsom's office fired back pretty hard.
Oh, absolutely. They turned it into a major political fight. They argued that the drivers whose licenses were revoked actually had valid work authorizations from the federal government.
So they're saying the problem wasn't us checking status incorrectly. It was confusion about federal work permits expiring or shifting federal guidance, kind of shifting the blame back.
That's the counter-argument, yes, implying that confusion was on the federal end, not a state mistake. And Newsom's spokesman, Brandon Richards, he didn't hold back, accused Duffy of spreading easily disproven falsehoods in a sad and desperate attempt to please his dear leader.
Wow. So pure political warfare breaking out.
Pretty much. And they tried to back this up by claiming the state had just been following guidance they got from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, when they issued the licenses in the first place.
It's like a classic blame game, right?
Yeah.
The state points back at the federal agencies that set the immigration rules.
It's a classic conflict over who's ultimately accountable, yeah.
But, okay, politics aside for a second. The safety data that kicked off this whole federal investigation, that seems pretty hard to ignore.
It really is. Federal investigators, they initially just looked at a small sample, only 145 licenses in California.
Okay, 145.
Yeah.
What did they find?
They found that a quarter of them, 1 out of every 4 they checked, shouldn't have been issued.
25%. That's a huge failure rate.
It's incredibly concerning. I mean, think about what that means. 1 in 4 drivers in that sample operating heavy trucks or buses with an invalid status. They specifically highlighted 4 California licenses that were still valid years after the driver's work permit had expired.
Years later. That's not a typo or a small clerical slip-up.
No, that points to a systemic breakdown in the checks and balances, with real and profound potential safety consequences.
Okay, but let me push back on that just a bit. They looked at 145 licenses, found a 25% problem rate, and used that to justify pulling 17,000 licenses. Is that sample size really robust enough to make such a sweeping decision, potentially taking thousands of working truckers off the road?
That's a really important question, right, about the methodology. The federal argument was basically that this pattern of error licenses, valid way past expiration, showed a systemic loophole, a procedural failure.
So the sample showed a deeper problem.
That was their claim. They argued the high failure rate in the sample meant the problem was likely widespread across the whole group of 17,000. And given the potential for, catastrophic accidents, they felt they couldn't afford to wait for a slow license-by-license audit. They needed a fast, comprehensive fix.
A swift response to a perceived crisis.
Exactly. And you have to see the CDL fight as just one piece of a much bigger picture, a much broader political battle. Governor Newsom's office actually sued the Trump administration to block using the National Guard for immigration raids.
Right, I remember that. They called it a step towards authoritarianism.
Yeah, and then Trump hit back publicly, criticizing Newsom for mistakes and incompetence. So the CDL issue became another front in that ongoing war. It's less about the paperwork, really, and more about federal power clashing with state policies, especially where they touch on immigration and national security.
Okay, so the political battle lines are clearly drawn. But whatever the outcome of the political finger-pointing, Secretary Duffy used this whole situation to fundamentally change the rules for everyone going forward. And this is where it gets really significant long-term, I think.
Absolutely. The feds announced a major regulatory shift, a new national standard for who can even get a CDL. And it makes it much, much harder for immigrants to qualify now.
This is the big regulatory change, a move to close that loophole, whether it was exploited or just misinterpreted by California.
Definitely. It sets a really drastic new national bar. It severely limits who can get a commercial license anywhere in the country.
So what are the new rules?
Yeah.
Which visa holders can actually still get a CDL now?
It's a very short list now. Under the new federal rules, only 3 specific visa classes are eligible. Just 3.
Which ones?
You've got the H-2A, that's for temporary agricultural workers, then the H-2B for temporary non-agricultural workers, and finally the E-2, which is for people making substantial investments in U.S. businesses.
H-2A, H-2B, E-2. That's it. That seems incredibly narrow. Why just those 3?
It is extremely specific. The H-2A and H-2B visas, they're really tied to filling specific temporary labor shortages, when there aren't enough U.S. workers for seasonal or specialized jobs.
Okay.
And the E-2, well, that's tied directly to bringing significant investment into the U.S. economy. So the message seems pretty clear. Getting a CDL is now seen as a privilege linked very tightly to specific, documented, and temporary economic needs or high-value investment, not just a general labor category anymore.
And a big part of this is verification, right? States can't just rely on old guidance.
Exactly. States now must rigorously check the applicant's immigration status directly against a federal database. No more ambiguity or relying on potentially outdated DHS guidance.
And the licenses themselves are different now, too.
Yeah, huge change there, too, these new CDLs. They'll only be valid for a maximum of 1 year or until the applicant's visa expires, whichever comes first.
1 year max. That means annual checks, annual re-verification.
It dramatically tightens compliance, constant checks against legal residency status.
The numbers here really drive home how big this change is. Nationally, you said there are about 200,000 non-citizens who currently have commercial licenses.
Around that number, yeah. But under these new, much stricter rules, only about 10,000 of those 200,000 drivers would actually qualify if they were applying today.
10,000 out of 200,000, that's what, 95% wouldn't qualify under the new rules?
A massive potential reduction. It means 190,000 drivers currently on the road legally could find themselves unable to renew their licenses when they expire.
Just to be clear, though, the rules aren't retroactive. So those 190,000 can keep driving until their current license is up for renewal.
That's right. They can keep their licenses until they expire. But once renewal time comes, they'll face these new, much tougher standards. Still, it signals a huge potential contraction in the labor pool for a really vital part of the economy.
And this change happened fast. Not through slow legislation, but through executive action driven by this conflict.
Exactly. And this kind of rapid, high-stakes regulation where the executive branch essentially forces states to change policy using federal leverage, often tied to safety or national security, it's a prime example of what some scholars call presidential regulation.
Presidential regulation.
Yeah, the idea that the president can use existing broad powers, maybe related to highway funding like here, or foreign affairs or emergency powers, to quickly push through significant domestic regulations. It kind of bypasses the slower, normal administrative rulemaking process to enforce uniform standards fast, especially when there's a perceived crisis like public safety on the highway.
So the federal government asserting its power because it felt the state policy was, well, too lax and dangerous.
Precisely. Asserting federal control where state action was deemed inadequate.
So let's wrap this up. What does this all mean for you, listening?
Well, we saw a powerful state, California, trying to manage its own licensing program, arguably with relaxed standards. This led to a huge compliance gap, highlighted tragically by fatal crashes, and ultimately resulted in 17,000 licenses being revoked.
And the federal government, using financial threats, remember that potential $200 million loss and clear safety data, stepped in very forcefully. It showed that states will comply when that kind of money and federal pressure is on the line. California had to act to avoid losing critical funding.
It really underscores the power of federal enforcement when national safety standards and immigration policy collide. The executive branch showed it could act swiftly and decisively to override state regulations if viewed as negligent.
It's a clear demonstration of federal leverage, eliminating what the administration saw as a dangerous loophole created by state policy. So the federal government definitely succeeded in forcing California's hand, getting those 17,000 questionable licenses revoked, all framed around improving safety. And on the surface, that seems like a straightforward win for safer roads, right? Uniform standards. But here's something to think about, our final provocative thought for you.
Given that the federal investigators found California wasn't just messing up expiration dates, but also failing to enforce English language rules and generally issuing licenses improperly, does this big federal crackdown truly guarantee safer roads across the whole country?
Or is this just the opening shot in a much larger ongoing fight over who really gets to control the labor market, immigration policy, and the rules for critical jobs like trucking across all 50 states?